Hello and welcome to another episode of Focal Point. I am the host, Chris deBoer, Executive Director of Reformed Perspective Foundation. And today I want to address the topic of the Great Reset, and I've titled this episode, Ready, Reset, Wait. In Canada, our Prime Minister spoke about the Great Reset, reimagining the future, in response to COVID-19. A lot of newspapers addressed this as though it were some sort of conspiracy theory that conservatives were concerned about. We shouldn't worry about this Great Reset as if it were some sort of global plan. What Mr. Trudeau was simply talking about was his vision to rebuild Canada better. So I did some research and tried to explore what is meant by this Great Reset and how it is applied in Canada. Well, there's an old saying, never let a crisis go to waste. And COVID-19 is rightly identified as a crisis with global impact, to be sure. But now our global leaders are using COVID to justify their already articulated agenda as expressed in the UN's Agenda 2030. Now, to be clear, the agenda hasn't changed because of COVID-19, but world leaders are now justifying taking extreme measures, often undemocratically, as they have justified their authoritarian approach in a crisis in pursuing the goals of Agenda 2030 and other globalist goals. Our leaders, the global leaders, do not want to let a crisis go to waste. Now, let me be clear that I am not a conspiracy theorist. I don't like listening to rumors, and even if some of the great conspiracies make some sense to me, I generally don't share them, and I certainly don't lose sleep over them. I am firmly convinced that Christ rules. He is at work through all of these minute attempts of mere mortals to change this world. They might have initial success. They might even have long-term success. But ultimate victory is Christ's, and those who belong to him will share in that victory. And we should not be surprised by this increased globalization. There's an increased disdain for the church. There's increased anxiety and fear-mongering too. COVID is, in my opinion, only a first step, a rumbling of greater changes and challenges ahead. The Apostle Peter tells us this in his second letter, chapter 3, that we should know that scoffers will come in the last days with scoffing, following their own desires. They will say, "Where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all things are continuing as they were from the beginning of creation." Well, many of our global leaders are scoffers. The World Economic Forum, the United Nations, and so many are scoffers and scoffing. And they're not living in submission to Christ the King, but rather they seek to be kings in their own strength and right. But the Apostle Peter reminds us that they, these scoffers, deliberately overlook this fact that the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and through water by the word of God, and that by means of these, the world that then existed was deluged with water and perished. But by the same word, the heavens and earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly. Take that to heart. It is by the power of God's word that things are working out as they are. God, by the power of his word, created all things. God brought his word to bring forth the flood. And God brought forth his word to restrain the flood from going further and longer. God is at work by the power of his word, and he will again speak. The thunder will sound, the trumpet will be heard, Christ will return. The victory is already ours when Christ died on the cross. We need to keep that context in mind as we consider the changes that are taking place all around us. As we explore this thing called the Great Reset, we explore it with discernment. We are going to be equipped for service, but we are not going to despair. So I want to explore what is meant by this Great Reset. And then identify how this vision for the world is being actively implemented already in Canada. And I want to share a godly response to these changes and challenges, a response in obedience to God's word and not rooted in fear. This effort to change the way the world functions on the social, economic, political, and environmental fronts is known today as the Great Reset. This term is articulated by the World Economic Forum, but it is hard to delineate this organization from the UN and its goals. They seem to be partners in a lot of things together. Let me introduce you then to the World Economic Forum. The WEF engages the foremost political, business, cultural, and other leaders of society to shape global, regional, and industry agendas. That's taken from their website. It's also described as, quote, the International Organization for Public-Private Cooperation, end quote. It's the organization, or at least one of them, that believes, quote, there is an urgent need for global stakeholders to cooperate in simultaneously managing the direct consequences of the COVID-19 crisis to improve the state of the world. The World Economic Forum is starting the Great Reset Initiative, end quote. So what do they mean by this Great Reset? Well, to begin, they suggest that the current crisis and its impact, quote, is fundamentally changing the traditional context for decision-making, end quote. Now, this comment about the context is important because the goals of the World Economic Forum and the UN are not changing. They remain as radical as ever. You can find them in Agenda 2030. They have 17 sustainable goals as well. So what is changing is the context, the justification for implementing the changes. They see COVID as the opportunity they need in order to advance their goals much more quickly and rapidly. Now, there's three main components of the Great Reset. And now I quote parts of their website. First, to steer the market toward fairer outcomes. They say government should improve coordination, for example, in tax, regulatory, and fiscal policy, upgrade trade arrangements, and create the conditions for a stakeholder economy. At a time of diminishing tax bases and soaring public debt, governments have a powerful incentive to pursue such action, and they are to implement long overdue reforms that promote more equitable outcomes. Depending on the country, these may include wealth taxes, the withdrawal of fossil fuel subsidies, and new rules governing intellectual property, trade, and competition. Second, they want to ensure that investments advance shared goals, such as equality and sustainability. They explain the large-scale spending programs that many governments are implementing represent a major opportunity for progress. Rather than using these funds to fill cracks in the old system, we should use them to create a new one that is more resilient, equitable, and sustainable in the long run. This means, for example, building green urban infrastructure and creating incentives for industries to improve their track record on environmental, social, and governance metrics. And third, governments need to harness the innovations of the fourth industrial revolution to support the public good, especially by addressing health and social challenges. They say that the pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world to create a healthier, more equitable, and more prosperous future. End quote. So those are the three elements of this World Economic Forum's vision of the Great Reset. And there's so much in there that we could pull apart to look at, for example, increased equitable outcomes. We would all argue for equality of opportunity, but equality of outcomes is very different. Also, we could explore what is meant by stakeholder economy or stakeholder capitalism, which is differentiated from shareholder capitalism. That could be explored in greater depth. But I want to explore how Canada, specifically, it has been responding to the COVID crisis. You'll notice right away that many of the government initiatives were implemented as an emergency fund, as an emergency response. And so the government initially actually sought to have a kind of blank check until December 2021. That was thankfully restrained. But in the meantime, The government continues to pursue this great reset in their response to COVID-19. Let's explore this further. On the Prime Minister's website, pm.gc.ca, there's a readout dated June 11th, 2020, entitled Prime Minister Trudeau Speaks with His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and the Commonwealth Group of Permanent Representatives to the United Nations. In this readout, we read that Trudeau thanked His Royal Highness Prince Charles for, quote, championing the Great Reset Initiative to build a better and more sustainable future for all, end quote. Key words in this readout include dialogue, collective action, global issues, sustainable development. He focused on the need to build greener economies and, quote, the importance of multi-stakeholder partnerships between governments, the private sector, and civil society in shaping the future global economy in a way that supports social inclusion, fairness, equity, and sustainability, end quote. Mr. Trudeau is completely bought into the Great Reset. At the end of November, the Canadian government provided a financial update. They have a plan to build back better, which includes investing in a 3-year stimulus package to jumpstart our economy, worth roughly 3 to 4% of GDP. The vision is, I quote, for making a long-run contribution to our future shared prosperity, quality of life, competitiveness, and our green transformation, end quote. They want to build, quote, an economy that is greener, more innovative, more inclusive, and more resilient, end quote, and continues to progress on climate and create jobs in the clean economy. The government suggests that the impact of COVID has affected some more than others. In fact, they say COVID-19 has caused a she-cession, rolling back many of the hard-won gains women have worked for over past decades. They are making this claim as the foundation for a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. Canada cannot be competitive, they say, until all Canadian women have access to the affordable childcare we need to support our participation in the workforce. Now, do you hear these challenges? They're going to focus on green technologies, pursuing the UN's Agenda 2030 goals. You'll notice there's a lack of help for the fossil fuel sectors. You will also notice that vision for a national daycare system once again. You see, this increases society's dependence on the government. And I can't figure out who's going to run this national daycare system. Increased bureaucracy, bigger government. But it seems strange that it would be a federal task, and one wonders how long before some kind of curriculum will be included for the child care centers, providing education to help ensure government controls the education of children as early as possible. They want the minds of our youth, and they want us dependent on the government from the cradle to the grave. Now, we also wonder who's going to pay for this great reset. Remember, the reset includes new taxation strategies. Canada is prepared to work, they say, unilaterally to ensure that everyone and everything is charged GST and HST. Digital platforms, distribution centers, and short-term rentals are on the list. The update reminds us that, quote, everyone must contribute their fair share so that the government has the resources to invest in people and keep our economy strong. And, quote, to help build a fairer Canada, the government is also examining new ways to use the tax system to address the rise of extreme wealth inequality as laid out in the speech from the throne, end quote. Notice, to build a fairer Canada, they're going to use the tax system in new ways to address the rise of extreme wealth inequality. So they put the words equality, inequality, and fair as if they were achieving the same things. Well, there is wealth inequality. Not everyone is equally wealthy. Not everyone is equally gifted. Not everyone makes the same decisions. This concern about wealth inequality and fairness is not rightly understood. Fair and equality are not the same thing. It could quite rightly be argued that it is unfair to tax the wealthier at a higher percentage of income than everybody else. That's not the case I want to make, but my point that I'm trying to underscore here is the government's use of this term fair and inequality. They are not the same thing. Creating a fairer Canada is not going to be addressed by taxing the wealthy. That seems inherently unfair. Let's take another look. Some of the ideas mentioned in the past in this attempt to address extreme wealth inequality includes an extreme wealth tax. The Guardian on September 23rd reported that a major element of the throne speech was a plan to raise revenue by finding additional ways to tax extreme wealth inequality. End quote. Of course, for most of us, this is not going to affect our bank accounts or our financial planning. But it should be clear, or at least it is to me, that such taxation is only a first step. Governments take small steps to achieve great plans. And the vision for our future in Canada seems to be increased taxation, starting with the small number at the very top, the very wealthy. And when that's successful, they'll move that number down. They'll tax the next income bracket below. And when that's successful, the next one below. And when that's successful, etc. And understand that increased taxation, in order to create a more fair Canada, reduces the autonomy, which they consider to be a major human right. This increased taxation to create a fairer Canada will decrease our autonomy and will increase our reliance on, our dependence on the government. So as our dependence on government increases, our autonomy automatically, by definition, decreases. For example, the Financial Post outlined on August 15 of 2020 that the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Corporation, also known as CMHC, had been investing in a study in partnership with the University of British Columbia to, quote, investigate ways to tax the equity Canadians have gained in their homes, end quote. The CEO of the CMHC is quoted in the article as saying that, quote, we need to call out the glorification of home ownership for the regressive canard, which is a false or baseless story, that it is. Imagine, that's an end quote, imagine working towards home ownership as a regressive canard. That's where we are today. Young people trying to become financially independent, not needing to rely on government handouts and bailouts, trying to own a home. And the CMHC CEO says that's a glorification and it's a regressive canard. That should not be a goal, home ownership. He may as well have said financial independence shouldn't be your goal either. What we really need to do is tax. Tax people who own their own house, the equity of their homes, tax it, so that government coffers can increase and dependence and reliance on the government also increases. My friends, I could go on and on about the state of Canada's political climate. Things in this country are changing rapidly. The expansion of assisted suicide well before the 5-year review period. The conversion therapy ban so broad that pastors and parents could be at risk for having healthy conversations with their children about sexual orientation. The out-of-control spending and this growing dependence of the masses on government subsidies, etc. But I don't want to discourage you. I wanted to share with you today that this thing called the Great Reset is not a conspiracy theory. When you study it, when you look at it, as it is articulated by the World Economic Forum, you see it at work already in Canada. If you read the economic update of November 30th, 2020, it's about 4 chapters and got a whole bunch of appendices. It is a document that is set on the Great Reset. It is going to bail out companies during the COVID crisis. And once the COVID crisis has diminished significantly, they will continue to invest. But they will not invest in the, quote, old system, but they're going to invest in creating a new economy. And this new economy is based on the growing dependence of the masses on the government. It's based on global leadership and on the demise of democracy. This is not fear-mongering. I am not afraid. These things all could happen in my lifetime and in the lifetime of my children. So I take these things to heart, and I am reminded of my task as a dad, as a Christian dad, to train up my children in the fear of the Lord, to train them so that they would, by God's grace, stand firm in the faith. You see, I think it's really important that we're careful in applying the book of Revelation, for example, to specific historical events, as if there's a definite fulfillment in a particular event of history. Rather, as history progresses, there are these regular signs that the book of Revelation is being fulfilled. I'm certain, for example, that our great-grandparents or our grandparents would have thought that Christ would return during World War II. Suffering was real in all parts of Europe in particular. So I do not know the Lord's plan in fulfilling the book of Revelation. But when I study that book, and I see the way the world is changing and really, in my opinion, unraveling before our eyes, I can't help but think that COVID is really only the beginning, and that many things will change in short order before our eyes as we speed the day of Christ's return. It is possible that Christ's return will still be delayed, and that there will be a short reprieve again. But with the United Nations, the World Economic Forum, the European Union, Canada, with the Biden-Harris administration and other nations all working towards a great reset, this vision of a global leadership and the demise of democracy and nation states, I can't help but wonder if this might indeed be the beginning of the end. Christ could come back today, and Christians would not be surprised, for the day of the Lord only comes as a surprise to those who are scoffers, who are mockers, who have lulled themselves into sleep, thinking to themselves, peace, peace, when there is no peace. You see, there is no peace between sinful man and God, but there is peace for Christians who love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, and their neighbor as themselves. There is peace for believers. And with those of us who have our eyes opened at the way the world is going, we should not be surprised that Christ is coming back. He could come back very rightly and righteously today. Do we live in that expectation? Christians, take heart. Be bold and courageous. Stand up and stand firm in the truth. Hold fast to your children. Equip them while we have time. Prepare the troops for the battle that is coming. Know that we fight from a position of strength and victory already. So may the Lord preserve us and our children as He ushers in His kingdom in all its glory. And be still, be at peace, do not be anxious, but rather be still and know that the Lord, He is God. Thank you for listening to this episode of Focal Point. If this episode or other episodes have been of encouragement to you, please consider making a donation to Reformed Perspective Foundation, which can be done through our website at reformedperspective.ca. Thank you so much, and God bless.